You walk through the world believing you can see. You trust your eyes the way ancient sailors trusted the stars, blindly, faithfully, desperately. But Steiner warned that the eyes are the most deceptive instruments the human being possesses. They give you shapes, colors, textures, movement. They give you the surface, but they do not give you truth. And the tragedy of modern life is that almost everyone believes the surface is enough. Steiner called this condition spiritual blindness, a sickness of perception so widespread that people no longer realize they are afflicted. You look at the world, but you do not perceive its inner life. You navigate the outer form, but remain untouched by the forces that animate it. And this blindness is not poetic, it is precise. Neuroscience now confirms something unsettling. More than 90% of what the brain sees is fabricated from memory, expectation, and prior associations. The eyes deliver fragments, and the mind constructs the illusion of a complete world. Vision is not perception, it is prediction. The brain is endlessly guessing, endlessly filling in the blanks, endlessly manufacturing a reality that matches your assumptions. So when Steiner said that human beings are blind, he wasn't speaking symbolically. He was describing a neurological fact. You do not see the world as it is, you see it as you are. But this condition did not begin with biology. It began with forgetting. Ancient wisdom traditions insisted that human beings once possessed an inner organ of perception, a sense that allowed them to see the soul behind appearances. In Hindu philosophy, it was the third eye, the seat of inner knowing. In Christian mysticism, it was the eye of the heart, capable of perceiving spiritual truth. In Hermetic texts, it was the inner sight, the capacity to witness the forces behind matter. Steiner simply gave it a more technical name, the organ of spiritual perception. Not metaphorical, but literal, something that atrophied through centuries of materialistic thinking. And the signs of this blindness are everywhere. You meet someone and evaluate their clothes, their posture, the way they move, but you do not perceive their essence, the architecture of their psyche, the invisible currents shaping their choices. You see events, but not the forces behind them. You see the behavior, but not the wound. You see the anger, but not the fear beneath it. You look at society and believe you understand it, but what you perceive is only the surface tension of deeper patterns, archetypes, karmic movements that you were never taught to recognize. This is spiritual blindness, the inability to see the truth behind form. And like all diseases, it has symptoms. You become fascinated with appearances, addicted to distraction, easily manipulated by narratives, overwhelmed by superficial information. You mistake noise for knowledge. You cling to the visible because the invisible terrifies you. You feel disconnected from your own life, unable to sense meaning beneath routine. You drift, not because you lack purpose, but because you lack perception. These are the early symptoms, the subtle tremors before the collapse. But the condition deepens. You begin to trust external authorities more than your own intuition. You lose the ability to sense when someone is lying, not because they are clever, but because you are blind. You allow society to dictate what is important, what is real, what you should fear. You see events on the surface, but remain unaware of the hidden intentions shaping them. You walk through life unaware that you are navigating a field of forces, psychological, spiritual, cultural, that influence you without your consent. And because you cannot see these forces, you become vulnerable to them. Steiner compared this stage to walking through a forest at night with a candle that has already burned out. You move, but you do not perceive the dangers around you. The world feels chaotic because you cannot see its underlying order. The world feels empty because you cannot perceive its inner depth. The world feels meaningless because you cannot see the currents of destiny, imagination, archetype, and soul moving beneath the surface. And yet, the most haunting part of this blindness is how normal it feels. People live their whole lives inside it without ever knowing they are asleep. They function, they work, they speak, they grow older, they raise families, they suffer, they distract themselves, and then they die. Never once realizing that the real world, the world of forces, patterns, essences, remained hidden from them the entire time. They never learned to look with the inner eye, the one Steiner insisted humanity must reactivate if it is to evolve rather than collapse. But even in the darkness, there is a whisper, an inner unease that tells you something is missing, something essential. A moment when you sense that the physical world is not enough, that the meaning you crave lies beneath the surface, not upon it. This unease is the first crack in the blindness. It is the soul knocking from the inside of your life, urging you to wake up. And here lies the haunting truth Steiner left behind. Spiritual blindness is not a punishment. It is a stage, a veil, a temporary condition that persists only until you begin to see inwardly. When you awaken this inner perception, the world changes. Not because the world became different, but because you finally became capable of seeing it. And once you begin to entertain the idea that vision is not the same as perception, that the eyes are only windows for fragments of reality, you start to understand why Steiner insisted that human beings walk through life as if half asleep. Spiritual blindness, as he described it, is not superstition or mysticism. It is a neurological fact disguised as metaphysics. The brain is not a camera capturing the world, it is a storyteller constructing it. And the most haunting part is this: the story it tells is based less on truth and more on habit, bias, trauma, and expectation. Modern science, with all its machines and measurements, accidentally proved Steiner right a century after he first sounded the alarm. Neuroscientists studying perception discovered that the brain receives only a thin stream of sensory data, raw, incomplete, chaotic. The rest is invented, not imagined deliberately, but assembled automatically, piece by piece, from memories, conditioning, and shortcuts. You think you see the world, but what you are truly perceiving is your past projected onto the present. Half memory, half hallucination. Steiner called this the prison of inherited perception. Neuroscience calls it predictive processing. Different words. Same truth. Your brain does not want reality. It wants efficiency. So it blinds you to anything that does not match your assumptions. It filters out anomalies. It removes contradictions. It edits truth into a shape you already recognize. And this is where the blindness begins. Not in the eyes, but in the interpretation. Consider how often you overlook the subtle expressions on someone's face because your mind already decided who they are. Consider how easily you misread danger because it contradicts the narrative you prefer. Consider how you fill emotional silences with stories that exist only in your own mind. These are not mistakes, they are neurological patterns, cognitive blind spots. And Steiner warned that they are spiritual obstacles, preventing you from perceiving the forces shaping your destiny. But the blindness grows deeper, more unsettling, when you examine how memory distorts perception. Research from MIT and Stanford shows that every time you recall a memory, you alter it. Not intentionally, but physically. Neurons rewiring themselves according to present emotion. This means the reality you believe you experienced is not stable. It shifts, it decays, it bends itself to your current mental state. And if your memories are fluid, then your sense of reality is a reflection of mood more than truth. Steiner anticipated this, calling memory a living organism that grows, forgets, and mutates. Science simply proved him correct. But the brain's blind spots go even further. There is the inattentional blindness that prevents you from seeing what is directly in front of you when your expectations are elsewhere. There is the emotional blindness that reinterprets events based on unresolved wounds. There is the cultural blindness that filters reality through societal conditioning. And there is the moral blindness that prevents you from perceiving the consequences of your own actions. You believe you are awake because your eyes are open, but awakening has nothing to do with vision. Steiner taught that spiritual blindness is a failure of inner movement, a stiffness of consciousness, a rigidity that prevents perception from flowing beyond habitual patterns. When consciousness becomes stiff, you see only what you already believe. You perceive only what your mind allows. You walk through life in a trance of familiarity, blind to the forces vibrating beneath the surface of things. The ancient traditions knew this well. In Buddhism, they called it avidya, the fundamental blindness that keeps beings trapped in illusion. In Christian mysticism, they spoke of the darkened eye of the soul, clouded by desire and fear. In Islamic Sufism, they described the veil that separates the heart from truth, a veil woven from the fabric of unexamined thoughts. These were not metaphors. They were descriptions of a neurological spiritual condition, long before science had the language to explain it. And the consequences of this blindness are profound. You interpret life through the lens of fear, trauma, and expectation, unaware that your perception is distorted. You cling to beliefs not because they are true, but because they are familiar. You misjudge people, situations, even yourself. You fail to see meaning where it whispers softly beneath the noise. You walk past synchronicities, messages, signs, blind not because they are invisible, but because your inner eye is closed. And yet, the most dangerous blind spot is the one you never suspect, the belief that you already see clearly. This illusion of clarity is the final seal on the prison. When you think you understand the world, you stop questioning the boundaries of your perception. When you think your senses are reliable, you stop searching for deeper truths. When you believe you are awake, you stop noticing the subtle sleep creeping through your consciousness. But here lies the paradox Steiner wanted humanity to face. The moment you recognize your blindness is the moment you begin to see. The first crack in the trance is doubt. Not fear, not certainty, but doubt. The gentle suspicion that the world is not what it appears to be. That your eyes have betrayed you, that your mind has shaped reality into a manageable illusion. This doubt is not weakness. It is the beginning of sight. Because only when the surface begins to crumble does the deeper world reveal itself. The world Steiner insisted exists not behind your eyes, but behind your awareness. And once you begin to suspect that perception is not merely a biological act, but a spiritual skill, something ancient stirs inside you. A faint recognition, like the echo of a forgotten language your soul once spoke fluently. Steiner insisted that human beings possess more than the five senses. He said we once had an inner organ, a subtle structure capable of perceiving the forces, intentions, and realities that lie beneath the surface of the physical world. Not imagination, not intuition. Something older, sharper, more exact. A sense designed not to detect objects, but to perceive essence. But somewhere along the winding path of history, this organ atrophied. Humanity turned outward, intoxicated by the visible, seduced by material certainty, hypnotized by surfaces. And as the eyes grew stronger, the inner sense grew weaker. We traded depth for clarity, truth for detail, wisdom for information. What Steiner called spiritual blindness was not the absence of sight. It was the abandonment of the organ that perceives meaning. Ancient civilizations knew this organ intimately. In Vedic India, it was the Ajna chakra, the seat of higher perception. In the Egyptian mysteries, it was symbolized by the eye of Horus, the faculty that sees the hidden structure behind form. In Christian mysticism, it was the eye of the heart, capable of witnessing the divine signature in every event, every encounter, every human being. Steiner believed these teachings referred to the same thing: the lost sense, the spiritual eye, the organ of inner sight that most people no longer remember how to use. But this organ did not disappear, it fell asleep. Modern psychology hints at its existence through phenomena it cannot fully explain. Intuition that bypasses logic, sudden insight without data, the ability to sense danger before it manifests, the inexplicable knowing you feel when someone's words do not match their inner state. Neuroscientists call these experiences thin slicing, rapid unconscious pattern recognition. But Steiner would have smiled at that explanation. He knew that behind the unconscious realm lies something deeper than memory and instinct. Behind the unconscious is perception in exile, and the symptoms of this dormant organ are everywhere. You feel, without understanding why, that someone is trustworthy or deceitful. You sense that a situation carries invisible weight. You walk into a room and immediately feel its emotional temperature shift your breath. These are fragments of the inner sense still trying to speak through the noise of modern life. But because you were never taught to trust these signals, you dismiss them, rationalize them, suppress them. You blind yourself again and again, not out of ignorance, but conditioning. Steiner believed that this inner organ is not merely psychological, it is anatomical within the subtle body, a real structure, dormant but intact, waiting to be reawakened through conscious attention. He described it as a spiritual eye that perceives the living truth behind phenomena, an instrument capable of sensing intention, karma, archetype, destiny. With it, you do not see objects, you see forces. You do not see people, you see the stories moving their soul. You do not see events, you see patterns unfolding across time. And when this organ sleeps, consequences unfold in predictable patterns. You misread people because you perceive only their surface. You feel lost in your own life because you cannot see the path beneath your feet. You repeat destructive choices because you cannot perceive the lesson hidden within them. You fill your days with noise because silence becomes unbearable. It threatens to reveal the emptiness created by the loss of inner perception. This is the root of spiritual blindness, not the inability to see, but the inability to perceive essence. Societies suffer from this blindness in collective form. Cultures prioritize the measurable over the meaningful, the visible over the real. Families repeat generational wounds because no one sees the invisible pattern beneath the pain. Groups fall into shared delusions because they have no organ to perceive the difference between truth and narrative. Humanity becomes hypnotized by the surface of life, unable to sense the spiritual currents guiding its evolution. But Steiner insisted on something radical. The inner organ can be rebuilt. Not through belief, but through attention. Not through doctrine, but through inner stillness. Not through devotion, but through disciplined perception. The first step is recognizing that the subtle impressions you dismiss are not fantasies. They are the embryonic signals of a dormant sense. The second step is learning to dwell in silence long enough for the inner world to speak. And the third step is confronting the discomfort of truth, because inner perception reveals not what you want to see, but what is. And this is where the path begins. Not with light, but with honesty. Not with clarity, but with the willingness to see without distortion. Not with answers, but with the courage to perceive the forces that shape your life. Because the organ you lost was not taken from you. You abandoned it. And now, standing at the edge of your own spiritual blindness, the question emerges quietly, like a whisper beneath consciousness. Are you willing to see again? And once you accept that humanity abandoned its inner organ of perception, once you feel the unsettling truth that you have been navigating life with only half of your true vision, something unexpected begins to happen. The world you thought you understood starts to flicker around the edges. Patterns appear and disappear. Conversations feel hollow. Events seem disconnected from meaning. Your outer vision is intact, but your inner world begins to whisper that something is terribly off. This dissonance is not madness. It is the first symptom of spiritual blindness revealing itself. Steiner said that spiritual blindness never appears dramatically. It creeps into a person's life in quiet distortions, subtle confusions, emotional shadows that feel familiar, yet strangely foreign. You do not wake up one day unable to perceive truth. You slowly lose the ability to recognize the difference between truth and noise. And before you realize it, you have been living inside a world of surfaces, mistaking appearance for essence, behavior for intention, coincidence for fate. The first shadow symptom is numbness to meaning. You move through your days like a ghost in your own life. Experiences happen, but they do not touch you. Conversations flow, but they feel empty, predictable. The world becomes flat. You sense that you are missing something essential, but you cannot name it. This numbness is not depression. It is the soul withdrawing because it no longer recognizes the world you present to it. The second symptom is hyperfixation on the visible. You cling to physical details, measurable facts, external validation. You trust numbers over intuition, logic over wisdom, appearance over essence. You analyze endlessly but understand nothing. You become addicted to proof because you have forgotten how to perceive truth. Modern society praises this state as rationality, but Steiner knew it was spiritual paralysis, the incapacity to feel the deeper currents beneath the surface of life. Then comes the distortion of intuition. You once felt subtle signals, an inner pull, a quiet warning, a sense of connection, but now these signals feel dim, unreliable, drowned by noise. You lose the ability to distinguish fear from instinct, anxiety from foresight, projection from perception. This is one of the cruelest symptoms. The inner compass spins without direction, leaving you wandering through your own decisions like a traveler who lost the map before understanding the terrain. Another symptom, emotional misalignment. You react strongly to things that do not matter, yet feel indifferent to things that should move you. Your emotional responses become dislocated, either numb or exaggerated. You cannot explain why small inconveniences overwhelm you while important truths leave you untouched. The psyche becomes inverted, as if your emotional eye were looking in the wrong direction. And then, almost inevitably, comes the collapse of discernment. This is the darkest sign. You lose the ability to sense hidden intentions. You trust people who should never be trusted. You doubt those who genuinely care for you. You cannot feel the consequences of your choices until they crash into you like a wave you never saw forming. Steiner warned that this collapse is not psychological. It is spiritual. When the inner organ of sight decays, the boundary between truth and illusion dissolves. You can no longer perceive what is nourishing and what is poisonous. You cannot see what strengthens your path and what derails it. You become vulnerable to manipulation, to projection, to the emotional gravity of others. In this state, people fall into relationships they cannot escape, commitments that drain their soul, paths that do not belong to them, and the collective symptoms are even more terrifying. Steiner believed that societies fall into spiritual blindness before individuals notice it. You see this in the obsession with material progress, the worship of speed, the addiction to distraction, the collapse of silence, the hatred of inwardness. A spiritually blind society prioritizes efficiency over wisdom, entertainment over depth, convenience over truth. And because people live inside this collective trance, they mistake blindness for normalcy. But beneath all these symptoms lies the most haunting one, a quiet fear of looking inward. You avoid silence, you avoid stillness, you avoid the moments when truth might catch you off guard. You fill your life with noise, not because you enjoy it, but because you cannot bear to see what the inner eye would reveal if it reopened. And yet, paradoxically, these symptoms are not signs of failure. They are signs of transition. Spiritual blindness is not final. It is a stage, a dark hallway between the life you inherited and the life you must awaken into. Steiner insisted that these symptoms appear only when the soul is ready to reclaim its inner sight. The numbness, the confusion, the misalignment, these are the beginnings of vision returning, not disappearing. They are the cracks through which light eventually enters. And as the symptoms intensify, a question begins to form in the quietest part of your consciousness, a question as old as mysticism and as immediate as breath. If your eyes cannot show you truth, what part of you will learn to see again? And as the symptoms of spiritual blindness deepen, as meaning fades and intuition fractures, you begin to sense that something inside you is slipping downward, quietly, inevitably, into a place Steiner described with almost painful clarity. He said that spiritual blindness is not a static condition. It descends in stages, like a dimming of light within the soul. You do not fall all at once. You drift. You descend through layers of disconnection until you reach a depth where the world still looks the same, yet everything feels hollow, stripped of essence, emptied of its inner truth. The first stage of this descent is subtle disorientation. You feel slightly off, as though reality isn't matching the emotional texture it should. You look at your life and feel a faint separation, as if watching yourself from a slight distance. Neuroscientists describe this as derealization, the brain's response to perceptual overload. But Steiner said it was the first veil lowering over the spiritual eye, the moment when outer clarity begins to replace inner sight. The second stage is loss of inner guidance. The compass you once relied on, your instincts, your subtle knowing, begins to malfunction. Decisions feel heavier, foggier, strangely inaccessible. You can no longer feel the rightness or wrongness of a path the way you once did. You ask others for advice because your own discernment feels muted. This is not indecision. It is the soul's voice being drowned by the mind's noise. The third stage is more insidious. Emotional dimming. Joy feels smaller. Sorrow feels distant. Excitement feels artificial. You observe your emotions rather than inhabit them. Life becomes filtered, like a photograph with faded contrast. Modern psychology calls this anhedonia, but Steiner recognized it as a spiritual symptom, the heart withdrawing because it no longer perceives the living essence beneath experiences. Then comes the inversion of perception, a stage where shadows appear brighter than light. Negative experiences demand your attention, while beauty passes unnoticed. Problems dominate your field of vision, while synchronicities fade into the background. You become trapped in the gravity of the material world, unable to sense the spiritual forces guiding your evolution. Steiner warned that this inversion is the soul's cry for awakening, though most people mistake it for misfortune or personal failure. The fifth stage is existential detachment. You begin to question the point of everything, not dramatically, but with a cold, quiet fatigue. Purpose feels arbitrary. Effort feels meaningless. People feel distant. You move through life as though acting in a play whose script you no longer believe in. And yet, this stage is not despair. It is a transitional numbness, the soul pulling away from illusions that no longer serve it. But the descent continues. The sixth stage is energetic vulnerability. When your inner sight goes dark, you become porous. Others' emotions seep into you more easily. Their fears slip into your chest. Their anxieties vibrate inside your nervous system. Without the inner organ of perception, your boundaries weaken. You become the carrier of forces that do not belong to you. Steiner said, this is the point where many people mistake psychic invasion for empathy. The seventh stage is identity thinning. You lose a sense of who you are, not dramatically, but piece by piece. Your desires blur, your motivations flatten, your preferences feel foreign. You become reactive rather than intentional. You live by momentum rather than vision. This is the soul's most fragile stage, when spiritual blindness begins to consume the very structure of selfhood. And then comes the deepest layer of all, the inner void. A silent emptiness, not depression, not sadness, but absence. A quiet space where your own essence should be, yet somehow isn't. Steiner described this void as the night of the soul's perception, the moment when the inner eye closes entirely, not to punish, but to prepare. Because in darkness, something ancient is forced to awaken. The human being, deprived of outer illusions, must finally turn inward and confront the forgotten organ of perception. This descent is not a failure. It is a rite of passage. Every mystic in history passed through these layers. Every seeker, every visionary, every soul that eventually learned to perceive truth had to first lose its way in darkness. Because the soul cannot reclaim inner vision until it realizes that outer vision is not enough. The disconnection is not the end of perception, but the clearing of space for a new sense to reawaken. And here lies Steiner's hidden paradox. The deeper the descent into blindness, the greater the eventual capacity for sight. The darkness is not punishment, it is preparation. For only when the old way of perceiving collapses can the new one emerge quietly, like a flame rekindling in the depths of the soul, revealing that the descent was not a fall, but a return. And as the descent into inner darkness deepens within the individual, a more unsettling truth reveals itself like a shadow creeping across the edges of awareness. Spiritual blindness is never merely personal. It spreads, it echoes, it multiplies through groups, families, entire cultures. Steiner insisted that human beings are not isolated islands of consciousness, but nodal points in a larger psychic field. When one person loses their inner sight, the blindness radiates outward. When many lose it, the blindness becomes a collective trance. And you've seen this trance before, even if you didn't have the language for it. Families who repeat the same emotional patterns for generations without ever noticing. Communities trapped in rituals of fear, anger, silence, or denial. Societies that worship the visible world so obsessively that they cannot perceive the spiritual starvation beneath their own progress. Steiner said that collective blindness is not an accident. It's an inheritance. It passes quietly through the lineage of consciousness like a dormant seed waiting for conditions to bloom into confusion. The first form of collective blindness emerges in families. Every family has an invisible script, beliefs, fears, stories, roles that each member performs without realizing it. A child grows up feeling responsible for everyone's emotional stability. Another becomes the scapegoat. Another becomes the silent witness. These patterns seem personal, but Steiner knew they were archetypal forces moving through the group, shaping behavior from behind the curtain of awareness. A spiritually blind family cannot see its own wounds. It only sees symptoms. Anger instead of pain. Control instead of fear. Withdrawal instead of grief. People respond to shadows without recognizing their source. And because no one sees the truth beneath the surface, the patterns repeat endlessly. Generations inherit emotional scripts they never agreed to perform. In this sense, spiritual blindness becomes a form of karmic momentum, an unconscious inheritance that reshapes lives before those lives even fully begin. The second form of collective blindness arises in relationships. Two people, both lacking inner vision, begin to orbit each other not as souls, but as projections. They mistake emotional need for love, trauma for destiny, attachment for connection. They interpret their partner's wounds as personal attacks. They replay childhood dramas unaware of their origin. They feel lost, but they blame each other because they cannot see themselves. Steiner believed that most relationship suffering stems not from incompatibility, but from blindness. Two inner worlds colliding without the organ that perceives truth. The third form is even larger, communities and groups. Human beings unconsciously align their perception with the emotional climate around them. A fearful group creates fearful individuals. A cynical group breeds cynicism. A group grounded in spiritual blindness cannot recognize wisdom, sincerity, or depth, even when these qualities stand directly in front of them. They elevate noise, reward performance, and punish truth. They follow illusions because illusions feel familiar. And in this way, spiritual blindness becomes the architecture of collective identity. But the most dangerous form of all is societal blindness, the blindness of an entire culture. Steiner warned that civilizations collapse not because of external threats, but because they lose the ability to perceive meaning. They worship material progress and slowly starve spiritually. They become addicted to distraction because silence terrifies them. They define truth through consensus rather than perception. And eventually, a society can become so spiritually blind that it mistakes the artificial for the real, the superficial for the meaningful, the loud for the wise. Modern life has perfected this blindness. Infinite information, zero understanding. Infinite contact, zero connection. Infinite images, zero vision. People scroll endlessly through illusions, mistaking stimulation for perception. They drown in choices, yet cannot sense direction. They flood their senses and numb their souls. A spiritually blind society does not collapse dramatically. It dissolves quietly from the inside out, unable to see the forces driving its own decay. And yet, the most haunting part is this: collective blindness feels normal. A spiritually blind group reinforces each other's blindness. A spiritually blind family calls dysfunction tradition. A spiritually blind society calls emptiness progress. When no one sees, everyone assumes they are seeing. But Steiner believed something radical. One awakened person can disrupt the blindness of an entire group. A single individual who regains their inner sight becomes a fracture in the collective illusion. Their clarity unsettles the patterns. Their awareness exposes what others unconsciously avoid. Their presence alone shifts the emotional architecture of the group. They are not understood. At first, they are usually resisted, even rejected, but their perception begins to create cracks in the trance. Truth leaks in through those cracks, and the group, however slowly, begins to feel the difference. Because spiritual sight is contagious. Just as blindness spreads, vision spreads too. And here lies the quiet paradox at the heart of Steiner's teaching. You do not awaken only for yourself. You awaken for everyone tied to you by destiny, history, ancestry, and love. Your inner vision becomes a lantern in rooms where no one realizes they've been sitting in the dark. And when you reclaim that forgotten organ of perception, you do not merely see differently. You make others capable of seeing. And once you recognize that spiritual blindness spreads through individuals, families, and societies like an invisible fog, there comes a moment when something inside you rebels against the darkness. A quiet revolt, a subtle refusal to remain asleep. This rebellion is the beginning of awakening, not the dramatic lightning strike people imagine, but a slow rebuilding of the inner organ that once allowed human beings to see truth, intention, and reality beneath the surface. Steiner insisted that awakening was not a gift, it was a reconstruction, a deliberate reactivation of a capacity that has been dormant for centuries. The process begins with discomfort. Awakening is never born from peace. It grows from irritation, confusion, unease, the sense that the world you see does not match the world you feel. You sense inconsistencies in people's words. You notice the hollowness of societal values. You feel the emptiness behind routines and conversations. This discomfort is not a sign of instability. It is the inner organ stretching after a long sleep, trying to move again. The second phase is discernment, the moment when you finally realize that not every thought is yours, not every emotion is real, not every belief is true simply because it is familiar. You begin to question the very foundations of your perception, your assumptions, your biases, your stories. Neuroscientists studying metacognition would say your prefrontal cortex is strengthening. Steiner would say your spiritual eye is opening a crack, letting in a sliver of light. Then comes sensitivity, often mistaken for fragility. You feel more subtly, intensely, inexplicably. You sense emotional atmospheres before anyone speaks. You perceive the energy behind actions, not just the actions themselves. This heightened sensitivity can feel overwhelming at first because your perceptual system is recalibrating to information it once ignored. But sensitivity is not weakness, it is the return of depth. The fourth phase of awakening is inner silence, not the absence of noise, but the quieting of internal chaos. You begin to create space between stimulus and response, between emotion and interpretation. This silence is essential because the inner organ does not perceive through sound or thought. It perceives through stillness. Ancient mystics sat in caves and monasteries not to escape life, but to awaken this organ. Steiner taught that silence is the soil in which perception grows. And then something strange happens. Patterns appear. Synchronicities increase, coincidences align. You begin to notice symbols repeating across unrelated situations. People arrive in your life at uncanny moments. Events unfold with invisible coherence. What once looked random begins to feel orchestrated, not by fate, but by meaning itself. This is the organ of perception, recognizing the architecture of reality, an architecture your physical eyes could never reveal. The fifth phase is inner vision, but not in the mystical sense many imagine. You do not see spirits or glowing lights. You see truth. You see the motivations behind people's actions. You sense the emotional wound beneath someone's anger. You perceive the direction of your life with surprising clarity. Inner vision is not hallucination, it is recognition. It is the ability to perceive essence, not appearance. Then the awakening enters its most challenging phase, dismantling illusions. Once you begin to see truth, the illusions you once depended on begin to crumble. Relationships reveal their real purpose. Social norms show their hollowness. Personal stories you've carried for years dissolve under the weight of inner clarity. This phase is painful. It requires shedding versions of yourself that were built to survive blindness. But Steiner warned that you cannot rebuild perception on a foundation of illusion. Everything false must fall. The next phase emerges quietly, inner authority. You stop looking outward for validation. You trust your perception even when others cannot see what you see. You stop outsourcing truth to society, to consensus, to experts, to tradition. This is the moment when the organ of perception becomes fully functional. The moment your vision is no longer dependent on the eyes, but on consciousness itself. And finally comes the last phase, integration. Awakening is not escape, it is embodiment. You return to the world not as someone disillusioned or detached, but as someone who can see beneath the surface while still walking through the ordinary. You participate in life while perceiving its deeper architecture. You listen to people while hearing what their soul is trying to say. You make choices not from impulse, but from inner alignment. This is what Steiner called upright perception, the fusion of spiritual sight with everyday living. And here lies the most haunting yet liberating truth. Awakening does not give you new eyes. It restores the eyes you lost. The organ of perception was never destroyed. It was buried beneath distraction, fear, conditioning, and noise. And when you rebuild it piece by piece, you do not become someone new. You become who you were always meant to be, a human being capable of seeing truth without needing proof, of sensing reality without needing permission, of perceiving meaning without needing the world to explain itself. Awakening is not enlightenment, it is remembering. And once you remember, you can never go back to blindness. And as the inner organ of perception begins to rebuild itself inside you, as you start to see patterns where others see randomness and meaning, where others see mere events, you also begin to understand that awakening without protection is a dangerous undertaking. Steiner insisted that once you start to perceive the deeper layers of reality, you must learn to guard your consciousness with the same seriousness that a traveler guards a lantern while moving through a storm. The more you see, the more vulnerable you become to forces that move invisibly through the world, forces of suggestion, emotional contagion, ideological pressure, collective fear, inherited beliefs, and spiritual inertia. People imagine that illusions are passive things, simply floating around waiting to be ignored. But Steiner knew they are active. They seek hosts. They feed on unguarded minds. They occupy the perceptual space that is not consciously claimed by the individual. This is why the protection protocol becomes not just helpful, but necessary for anyone reclaiming their inner sight. The first element of this protocol is the cultivation of inner steadiness, a kind of mental gravity that prevents your attention from being dragged by every wave of emotion or narrative around you. Neuroscience calls this metacognitive stability. Meditation teachers call it equanimity, and Steiner described it as the soul's spine. It is the capacity to remain centered, even when the world pulls you in contradictory directions. When this inner steadiness is present, suggestions lose their grip. Manipulative narratives, whether from individuals or institutions, cannot infiltrate your consciousness as easily because your attention is not scattered. It is anchored. The second element is perceptual discrimination, the ability to distinguish between what your senses deliver, what your mind interprets, and what reality actually is beneath these layers. Most people lump these three phenomena together, assuming that what they see and what they think are one and the same. But for someone who is awakening, the separation becomes clear. You begin to recognize how much of your perception is shaped by memory, expectation, emotional residue, and unexamined assumptions. This recognition becomes a shield. The moment you realize that perception can be manipulated is the moment manipulation begins to lose its power. The third element of protection is emotional sovereignty, a term Steiner never used but constantly implied. To be emotionally sovereign means that your inner state is not dictated by the atmosphere around you. When someone's fear fills the room, you do not absorb it as your own. When collective anxiety rises, you feel it brushing against your field but not entering it. When a person speaks from anger, insecurity, or projection, you sense their emotion clearly but do not merge with it. This skill is not coldness or detachment, it is clarity. It is the recognition that compassion does not require you to become a container for another person's chaos. The fourth element, perhaps the most misunderstood, is the strategic use of withdrawal. Modern culture worships constant engagement, constant communication, constant stimulation, but Steiner understood that withdrawal is not escape. It is recalibration. When the world feels overwhelming, you step back not because you cannot handle life, but because you are restoring your perceptual alignment before it bends under external pressure. Strategic withdrawal creates the silence necessary for the inner organ of perception to speak. Without silence, the voice of truth is drowned, not because it is weak, but because the world is too loud. The fifth element of the protocol is boundaries of attention. People believe that boundaries concern only behavior or physical space, but Steiner taught that the deepest boundaries are perceptual. What you allow into your field of awareness, what you give emotional energy to, what you mentally chew on, what you replay, what you internalize. If you allow every story, every crisis, every fear broadcast by society into your consciousness, you will lose the capacity to perceive truth. Your inner organ of perception will drown under the weight of borrowed narratives. Protecting your attention is protecting your sight. And beyond all these elements lies something even more subtle but essential: the return to the center of selfhood, not as ego, but as locus of perception. Without a clear center, your inner sight has no point of reference. You become vulnerable to illusions because you do not know where you stand. Steiner taught that the human I, the true self, is the only structure strong enough to resist collective blindness. When you stand in your center, you do not become rigid or closed. You become clear. You see without distortion. You perceive without collapsing into the emotions or stories of others. You remain open, yes, but not unguarded. What makes this protocol so necessary is the reality that your perception does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a world of forces, psychological, emotional, cultural, and spiritual, constantly seeking influence. Advertising pulls at your desires. Social media manipulates your attention. Political narratives hijack your fears. Family patterns shape your emotional reflexes. Childhood wounds color your interpretations. Collective consciousness presses against your inner space like a tide seeking an opening. Without protection, your awakening becomes unstable. Without boundaries, your perception becomes diluted. Without inner sovereignty, your clarity becomes fog. Steiner never wanted humanity to awaken blindly. He wanted people to awaken wisely, to see not with the naked eye, but with the inner structure capable of discerning reality from suggestion. And when this protection protocol becomes part of your daily inner life, something extraordinary happens. You begin to see the world not as a battlefield of competing illusions, but as a layered reality where truth is always present beneath the noise. Your sight deepens, your discernment sharpens, your intuition strengthens, and you finally understand that protecting your perception is not an act of fear, but an act of reverence, because the ability to see truth is sacred, and sacred things must be guarded. And as the protection protocol becomes a living part of your inner architecture, as you begin to stabilize your perception and guard it from the countless forces that seek to bend it, you eventually reach a quiet but profound frontier within yourself, a threshold where outer sight and inner sight cease to be separate functions. It is here, Steiner insisted, that the journey of awakening becomes irreversible because the soul begins to perceive what the physical eyes cannot hold. This is the threshold of true seeing, a place not of visions or supernatural spectacle, but of a deeper recognition that reality is layered, and that meaning exists beneath every surface like a hidden pulse. Crossing this threshold begins with a subtle yet powerful shift in how you experience the world. You notice that people's words no longer matter as much as the tone beneath them, the intention guiding them, the emotional structure that shapes their behavior. You sense motivations that are never spoken aloud. You perceive the emotional wounds others try desperately to hide behind confidence, humor, or silence. Nothing appears random anymore. Even the smallest encounters carry a sense of significance, as though life itself were speaking through events, nudging your awareness into deeper alignment. This is not superstition. It is the reactivation of a dormant perceptual faculty finally remembering its purpose. But this new way of seeing also strips away illusions with an honesty that can feel both liberating and disorienting. You begin to recognize the difference between the persona someone presents to the world and the truth of who they are inside. You feel the discrepancy between the life someone lives and the life they are meant to live. You sense when a conversation is authentic and when it is merely a performance shaped by fear, expectations, or unconscious patterns. Once you cross this threshold, you cannot return to the comfortable blindness that once shielded you from these deeper layers. The world becomes clearer, but also more transparent, and transparency requires courage. One of the most transformative aspects of this threshold is the sudden ability to perceive patterns across time. The events in your life no longer seem isolated. They begin to form a narrative of growth, challenge, and meaning that you never noticed before. People who enter your life unexpectedly are no longer accidents. They are catalysts, mirrors, or turning points. Difficult experiences reveal themselves as initiations rather than punishments. Mistakes become lessons rather than failures. Even the painful chapters of your past start to look different, not because the suffering disappears, but because you can finally perceive the inner transformation that grew out of it. Steiner described this capacity as seeing the karmic web of your existence, the way choices, relationships, and experiences are woven together by deeper forces shaping your evolution. Modern psychology hints at this through narrative identity theory, suggesting that meaning is constructed across time, not in isolated fragments. Yet Steiner's vision was far more profound. True seeing means recognizing that your life has been in conversation with you all along, but you were too blind to hear what it was saying. Another dimension of this threshold is the ability to sense the emotional reality beneath physical spaces. Rooms, places, environments carry residues of events and emotions that linger like invisible imprints. Most people walk through these spaces without noticing anything unusual, but once your inner perception sharpens, you begin to feel the temperature of a place. A silence that feels peaceful versus a silence that feels heavy. A home that carries tension even when empty. A workplace that hums with anxiety beneath its professionalism. These impressions are not imagination. They are the subtle signals that spiritual blindness filters out. But perhaps the most powerful transformation is the way you begin to perceive your own inner life with clarity that once seemed impossible. You notice the early formation of thoughts that once operated unconsciously. You sense emotional patterns before they erupt into reactions. You catch yourself shaping reality according to old wounds, and you interrupt the pattern. This self-perception is not self-criticism. It is self-awareness in its highest form. It marks the moment when you become the witness, rather than the prisoner of your own psychology. And yet, crossing this threshold also brings a profound responsibility. The more you see, the harder it becomes to pretend. You can no longer participate in conversations that revolve around illusions. You cannot force yourself to believe narratives that contradict your inner perception. You begin to lose interest in superficial explanations, hollow relationships, and empty pursuits. The world demands authenticity from you because your perception can no longer sustain anything less. This is often the moment when people around you say you have changed, not understanding that you have simply begun to see. Steiner believed that at this threshold, the soul must learn to hold its perception without collapsing under its weight. True seeing is not about judgment or superiority. It is about recognizing the spiritual architecture behind human behavior and responding with clarity rather than confusion. It requires humility, because the more you see, the more you recognize your own limitations, blind spots, and karmic lessons. The organ of perception does not grant omniscience. It grants insight, and insight requires balance. Finally, the most astonishing aspect of this threshold is the way it changes your relationship with truth. You no longer search for truth externally as something others must reveal to you. You begin to feel truth as a resonance inside your own being. It is not intellectual. It is not emotional. It is perceptual. When something is true, it aligns your inner world in a way you cannot explain logically. When something is false, it creates a subtle dissonance that you can no longer ignore. The physical eyes see objects. The inner organ sees alignment. And this is what Steiner meant when he said that true perception is the beginning of spiritual freedom. Because once you cross this threshold, reality becomes a living conversation rather than a static environment. Truth becomes experiential. Vision becomes multidimensional, and your life becomes something it never was in the days of blindness. Coherent, intentional, meaningful. And once you cross the threshold where outer sight yields to inner perception, once you begin to recognize patterns, intentions, emotional architectures, and karmic movements that were previously invisible, you arrive at the last and most unsettling revelation of Steiner's teaching. True spiritual sight is not comforting. It is not gentle. It is not a soft illumination that makes life easier. It is a radical stripping away of illusion, a confrontation with the world as it truly is, without filters, without narratives, without the psychological cushions that blindness once provided. Steiner warned that awakening is not a glow, it is a fire, and anyone who seeks to see must accept the cost of seeing too much. The first thing you realize when spiritual blindness dissolves is how many of your previous beliefs were shaped not by truth, but by fear, memory, and conditioning. You start to see how often you accepted the version of reality presented by others simply because it required less effort than developing your own perception. You recognize how much of your identity was constructed from expectations you did not question. And you finally understand why Steiner said that the greatest obstacle to spiritual sight is not ignorance but comfort. Blindness is easy. Vision is demanding. With true sight, people's motivations become transparent in ways that are both liberating and painful. You see the insecurity behind arrogance, the longing behind cruelty, the fear behind control, the unresolved grief behind detachment. This clarity deepens compassion, but it also removes excuses. You can no longer idealize what was once harmful or demonize what was once misunderstood. Everything becomes layered, and you begin to grasp why Steiner insisted that moral judgment becomes nearly impossible once perception matures. You see too many influences, wounds, karmic patterns, and unconscious forces moving through every individual to condemn them as simply good or bad. You realize that spiritual sight dissolves simplistic categories, not by intellectual reasoning, but by direct perception. Then comes the next, even deeper consequence. You begin to see your own life stripped of the narratives that once sustained it. You understand the real reasons behind your choices, the unconscious wounds shaping your behavior, the roles you accepted in your family, the patterns you replicated in relationships, the lessons you avoided because they demanded more inner honesty than you were ready to face. This self-revelation is not pleasant. It is not romantic. It is not the glamorous awakening people fantasize about. It is a type of spiritual nakedness that leaves you simultaneously humbled and empowered. For the first time, you meet yourself without distortion. But the most profound aspect of Steiner's final revelation is the recognition that reality itself is composed of layers of meaning that cannot be perceived by the physical senses. When spiritual sight awakens, the world becomes almost unbearably alive. Events carry signatures. Encounters carry openings. Difficulties carry initiations. Challenges carry precise teachings, as if something intelligent were arranging the curriculum of your life. Steiner believed this intelligence was not external but woven into the very fabric of consciousness. You begin to perceive that you are not moving through life randomly. You are participating in a dialogue with existence. This realization brings an unexpected form of freedom. Not the freedom people usually imagine, the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to perceive reality without being enslaved by fear, illusion, or inherited perception. The freedom to live according to inner truth rather than external noise. The freedom to choose paths aligned with your deeper self, even when they defy the expectations of those around you. Steiner called this state initiation, not because it grants power, but because it grants responsibility. Once you see, you cannot unsee, and you must live accordingly. Yet this freedom is accompanied by a subtle loneliness. Not isolation, but a quiet recognition that most of the world remains asleep, navigating their lives through filters you no longer share. You speak a language that others do not yet understand. You perceive layers they cannot yet feel. This is why Steiner insisted that awakening must be accompanied by patience and humility. True sight must never become superiority. It must become stewardship. Those who see are responsible not for dragging others into awakening, but for holding the lantern steady while others find their own way. And then, slowly, something unexpected occurs. The loneliness transforms into connection of a new kind, not with individuals who share your worldview, but with the deeper essence of life itself. You begin to feel guided, accompanied, witnessed by something larger than the self you once believed was alone. You sense a continuity between your inner world and the world around you. You no longer ask, what is the meaning of life? Because you perceive meaning unfolding in real time. You stop searching for purpose and begin living as purpose. This is the terrifying freedom Steiner spoke of. The freedom to see reality as a living, breathing organism of consciousness. The freedom to perceive yourself not as a passive observer, but as a participant in a vast spiritual unfolding. The freedom to walk through the world with eyes that no longer settle for surfaces but seek essence in everything. And the final echo of Steiner's teaching lingers long after the blindness dissolves. Seeing the truth will not make your life easier, but it will make your life real. And in the quiet chambers of the awakened soul, real is worth more than safe.